former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Joel, always a pleasure to see you here. This statement written by the G7, pretty incredible. They say, look, Russia will have massive consequences and severe costs should it invade Ukraine. And they go on to say that any use of force to change borders is strictly prohibited, and Russia should be in no doubt that further military aggression against Ukraine would have massive consequences here. How unprecedented is this statement coming from the G7?
Well, Baker, it's great to be with you. And it's not just unprecedented, but it's very clear and it's concise and it's to the point. And that's what Vladimir Putin needs to hear. He basically, for the last 5 years, had a free pass from Donald Trump. He's testing the limits, trying to see how far he can go with Joe Biden now in the White House, and flexing his muscles to try to reconstitute much of the former Soviet Union. And it does have Europe very nervous. I was in Germany in October. People are looking over their shoulder at Russia. They understand that Russia feels ascendant, and this physical threat against Ukraine is real. We have to remember only in 2014, Russia invaded and still occupies a significant chunk of Ukraine through the Crimea. It's killed thousands of Ukrainians in the process of that. So it's a serious threat, and it's a good, strong statement by the G7.
Now, officials have basically said that potentially Russia, with the amount of troops that are going across the border, maybe could invade Ukraine as soon as January, maybe February, although there's no indication that Vladimir Putin has made up his mind about what he's going to do here. What do you think he is doing there, then? If there's no military, if they're not going to do a military, some sort of strike there, why is he at the border then?
Well, Vladimir Putin is definitely a poker player. He's taken a lot of risks, and he certainly at this moment understands that he has a chance to either invade if he wants to take that risk, or potentially to negotiate some kind of concession as he sees it from the Western countries, from NATO, be it missile interceptors, be it a weakening commitment to NATO, weakening commitment to NATO expansion. There are a lot of issues from Putin's perspective that he wants to try to handle and extract concessions. So he's playing a sort of a poker game right now, but he's playing with lives. And I think Joe Biden and the people around him understand this. They understand they have to continue to be tough. And we also do have many tools at our disposal, not military in terms of having a war with Russia. That's not what we're talking about, but certainly in terms of sanctions and pressure, cyber, and strengthening our allies in that region. So he's playing poker. He wants concessions, but I don't think Joe Biden is in the mood right now for just giving concessions at this moment.
Yeah, what do you think at the end of the day is going to happen here? Because you mentioned sort of the financial repercussions, because again, I'm not going to say never likely, but it's incredibly unlikely that we would have any sort of military intervention going to the border there. But given the fact that you now have Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and now the United States basically in tandem here, saying that financial consequences could happen here to Russia if they invade Ukraine, what do you think happens?
Yeah, Baker, there have been sanctions on Russia since its invasion of Ukraine, and also for human rights violations and atrocities through the Magnitsky Act. There have also been a lot of open spots and basically gaps in those sanctions. So if Russia wants to do what it's doing, if Putin wants to keep on going further, there will be many tools that the financial system can use against him. And that the United States now is gathering our allies in a way that is really unprecedented. Germany, for example, has had a lot of business interaction with Russia, including with the Nord Stream pipeline. There are ways to get around that now, and there are ways to try to push back. And with the new German government, certainly the Biden team is looking at that as a way to close those gaps. And for Russia, it's a very extractive oil industry-based economy. It can't afford to just be sanctioned out of the global economy, and certainly not in the winter. But that's what Putin is looking at, and it's a high-risk proposition for him if he wants to go forward. And also, I should mention, he is in a war and in military conflict off and on with Ukraine. That costs lives. And the Russian people, while they're silent at this moment because Russia's a dictatorship, it doesn't mean that they'll be silent if their young people begin to go into Ukraine and fight a war that Putin provoked on his own.
Well, so what do you think happens then with Ukraine, with NATO? Because much of this stems from Putin not wanting NATO and the Republic of Georgia to join NATO allies. What do you think happens then? What do you think potentially they do get included here, and then you have Putin going apoplectic as a result of that?
Well, there was a meeting last week President Biden had with what's called the Bucharest Nine, the Eastern European countries, and they're all looking at NATO now, and many are NATO members as their bulwark. And so, paradoxically, while Putin wants to weaken NATO, he's actually strengthening NATO by pushing forward west and by making these threats. And so NATO is in a stronger position with Joe Biden calling for NATO unity and with it seeing a real threat coming from the east. So I think what we're going to see is more NATO engagement, interoperability between countries. The Afghanistan mission is over. And so in many ways, this is lining up for a more cohesive and coherent NATO going forward than we've seen in many years.
Do you ever see a scenario where China gets involved in this whatsoever, even though Vladimir Putin has had better relationships with Xi Jinping than maybe we have? But do you ever see a scenario where China gets engaged in this?
Well, the irony here is that China can just sit and watch and lick its chops, so to speak, and just see Russia engaging with NATO and the West back and forth while China continues to advance in the East and in Asia. Joe Biden, the White House, they haven't taken their eye off that ball at all, certainly. But this does keep us occupied now in a theater that we weren't expecting to just a couple of months ago when the president had the United States withdraw from Afghanistan. So China, it's a key player. It doesn't have to get involved. It's its benefit to not be involved. And then there are other issues. Just to mention, there's the Iran nuclear negotiations where Russia and China are at the table. So while we're having this discussion, we also have to remember that there are areas where there has to be engagement and diplomatic partnership to address other threats. But certainly China doesn't benefit from getting in the middle of this.
Yeah, great insight as always. Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Joel, thank you so much for getting up early with us.